Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to you all. Very nice to see you here. This session concerns new horizons in research funding, and I'm sure that all of you are aware that there are indeed new horizons. NHMRC, for example, has recently redefined the way in which it proposes to fund research for the future. In the past 5 years, there's been a rejuvenation of interest in research in the New South Wales Ministry of Health with the formation of an Office of Health and Medical Research, and that too has taken serious initiatives in regard to funding of research in the state, and we'll be hearing about that as well. And then third, there's been the advent of Medical Research Future Fund, which is still defining the overall purpose and the parameters within which it will be funding research, but it has particular relevance to the advanced health research translation centres, of which Sydney Health Partners, banner over there describes it in case you haven't heard of it, but we're one of the partners in Western Sydney with Northern and Sydney LHDs and the Children's Hospital Networks and the various affiliated institutes. So three dimensions to the changing horizons in health research, medical research funding. So my expectation is that the majority of people here will be here with a high level of altruistic self-interest. If that's not slightly oxymoronic, well then don't worry, let's move on. But I hope that you'll listen to what's said with a view to addressing the question, what's in it for me? And what can I do to make use of these opportunities to fund the research in which I'm interested in conducting or I'm already conducting? The format of the evening is that we will have an hour together, and my expectation is that the three speakers will occupy probably 40 to 45 minutes of that hour, and then there'll be an opportunity for asking questions. And to start the evening, it's my great pleasure to welcome back to Westmead, as though he never left, Professor Bruce Robinson, former Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, but now in one of his several roles, he's the chairperson of NHMRC. Bruce Robinson.
Thanks very much, Steve. Now, where's the clicker to make the slides change? This is a mystery, is it?
Press an arrow on the keyboard.
Here we go, here's a keyboard, fantastic. Okay, look, there's a keyboard.
Yeah, just hit the arrow.
It does. Okay, so look, thank you very much for having me today. By way of introduction, I should point out that the work that I'm going to be talking about, that is the reform and restructure of the NHMRC grant program, has not been work that I've done. I happen to be the chair of the council of the NHMRC, but this work has really been the child of Anne Kelso, who's the CEO, very capable CEO of the NHMRC, and it's been informed by an expert advisory group that was led by Steve Wessling, who was the Dean of Medicine down at Monash and who's now the Director of SAMRI in Adelaide. There was very clearly a need that was perceived by Council, and that's why we talked to Anne about this, and she readily accepted the challenge, to reform the way NHMRC did its business. You would all be aware of the data that's shown here on this graph. The funding rate declining as the inexorable rise in number of applications for grants rose to over 40% in 2015-2016. And the number of grants that were being able to be funded remained throughout that period relatively static. The MREA, the Medical Research Endowment Account, currently allocates each year about $800 million for research that's supported by NH and MRC each year. That amount of money is set to stay relatively static. There may be slight increases in line with inflation, but there won't be any overall dramatic increase in that amount of money, and that's been incorporated into the budget in the forward estimates. I'm learning more about forward estimates as I spend more and more time in Canberra. Unfortunately, I don't have good news for you in the sense that that amount of money is unchanged. There is, however, a new fund, which Don will be talking more about, the Medical Research Future Fund, which is set to rise ultimately to be dispersing each year an amount somewhat similar to that being dispersed by the MREA, although the mechanism for dispersal of that money is going to be somewhat different. What this slide shows is a system under great pressure. Not only fewer people getting their grants funded, but very large numbers of grants being unfunded and of course all requiring peer review to be categorised as being unfunded, just the same as those that require peer review to get funded. So a lot of time, in essence, being wasted by people putting in applications and being wasted by people reviewing those applications. Very clearly, the NHMRC felt that something had to change. So it undertook a review of the current grant program, particularly to examine the structure of that current program, to consider and then consult on alternative models for development, for the provision of funding for research, and then to develop and workshop a preferred new model. The current grant program, as you know, is essentially comprised of 4 components: fellowships and scholarships, program grants, project grants, and then strategic and leveraging grants. The purpose of each of these is shown there. Clearly there were problems in just one aspect of this, in that fellowships and project grants were funded separately, so it was not unusual. And in fact, in the last couple of years that I was at the university, there were people who got their fellowship but then didn't get their project grant, and there were people who got their project grant but didn't get their fellowship. So the separation of those 2 grants was the first rather nonsensical aspect of the current grant program. There was also concern expressed by some people, but of course not everyone, that there was an increasing amount of money from the NH and MRC being used to support clinical trials. Clinical trials becoming more and more frequently done and becoming more and more expensive were gradually increasing as a percentage of the total allocation spent on research. The granting entities, such as Centres of Research Excellence grants, development grants, partnership centres and targeted calls for research and international collaborative schemes, of course, were all funded out of the 4th pot, the strategic and leveraging grants, and that is one which is set to stay relatively unchanged. The current grant program spent about 50% of its money on project grants, about 20% on the strategic and leveraging grants. Program grants took about 13%, and fellowships and scholarships about 16%. So the objectives of the reform, and this was a set of objectives that were developed by the review team at the conclusion of their review, were essentially threefold. The first was to try to encourage innovation and creativity across all fields of health and medical research. This wasn't a review about trying to fund translational research or health services research or basic research. The idea was to try to encourage innovation and creativity across all of the fields of medical research. It was also thought very important that the reform should particularly provide opportunities for talented researchers at all stages of their career. There was a strong sense that early career researchers in particular struggled often to develop a track record which enabled them to subsequently get funded. And the third objective was to try to minimise the burden on researchers themselves, not only in writing grants but in peer reviewing grants, as I mentioned earlier, thereby freeing up more time for them to actually do research. And it was the trying to fulfil these objectives that led to the new grant program. So the new grant program now has 4 major categories of grant. The first of these is investigator grants. The second is synergy grants. The third are ideas grants, and the fourth are strategic and leveraging grants. The strategic and leveraging grants are relatively unchanged. These are to support research that addresses identified national needs and incorporates the various granting programs that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. What's been changed is the introduction of a category called ideas grants, which are really there to try to support more focused, innovative research projects which address a specific question. And for these particular grants, track record is not so important a component of the overall assessment process. So these are a particularly useful way of a person who's either been out of the workforce for a period of time for one reason or another, or who has not been in the workforce for long, or is starting off, to come along with a good idea that's assessed relatively freshly without a great consideration of their track record. Investigator grants are really focused around people, and I'll go more into those in a moment. And synergy grants, in a sense, are a little bit like the old program grants. They're to support the work of multidisciplinary teams who are working together to answer major questions that couldn't be answered by a single person. The philosophy behind this new grant program is one that funding across the spectrum of health is really important. Investment in people who do have outstanding achievements and promise is important. Innovation is important, and also, of course, we have to meet specific objectives, and from time to time those specific objectives of government do change, and government, of course, always reserves the right to specifically identify areas that it wants people to focus their attention on. And there are areas, you might have seen the recent announcement of the MRFF, antimicrobial resistance, for example, is an area that government specifically would like people to do work in, and will be funded through the recent call that was announced just in the last day or so from the MRFF. So some of the characteristics of these new grant types: first of all, the investigator grant. These are 5-year grants. There's a single chief investigator. The single chief investigator's salary may be incorporated into the grant if they need a salary, but if they're a tenured university person and they don't need a salary, then they can apply only for a research support package. If they do need a salary, though, that salary and the research support package are bundled together in the investigator grant. So a person won't end up with one or the other as they have in the past. I've got to say, I thought that was one of the major failings of the old scheme. I knew people here at Westmead, people at the George Institute, for example, who got their grant but didn't get their fellowship, or who got their fellowship but didn't get their grant. It seemed nonsensical. Synergy grants, large grants. These are grants of a fixed budget of $5 million, 4 to 10 investigators, again for 5 years. Ideas grants, again 5 years, between 1 and 10 investigators. And they're really, the success of these is based upon the idea, and there is a budget requested for research support. It is possible for a person to have salary incorporated in that up to a PSP 5 level. So salary can be obtained through an ideas grant. And then finally, the strategic and leveraging grants, which I've touched on before, incorporate the CREs, development grants, partnership centres, etc. So they are, broadly speaking, the features of the new grant system. One of the other features of the new grant system is capping. This has been slightly controversial, but it's felt that some form of capping is required to try to spread the love. Is that me or you, Tony?
No, that's just somebody trying
to dial in, hack into this presentation. So people are able to hold an investigator grant and a synergy grant, or apply for. They're able to only hold one each of those. A person can hold 2 ideas grants, and the number of strategic and leveraging grants that a person can be involved in are not capped relative to any of the other grant schemes. So in essence, you're capped at 2 grants in any of the first 3 schemes. We expect... Sorry? Oh, it's gone. So that's what I've been hacked. I wasn't joking, I thought. Okay, so I've talked about capping. I'll talk about the relative amounts of money then that are going to be allocated through these different schemes. The investigator grants will now be allocated a total of about 40% of the $800 million budget. There you go. The ideas grants, 25%. Synergy grants, these are the big ones, the $5 million ones, up to 10 of these a year, 5%. And the strategic and leveraging grants, 30%. So a change in distribution of the allocation of the $800 million under the MREA. The clinical trials allocation I touched on before currently runs at about $60 to $80 million a year through the NHMRC, and that's now going to come out of the strategic and leveraging grants pot. That, of course, has brought joy to some of the people who do more basic or translational research, who feel that clinical trials were gradually consuming more and more of the project grant funding. It's tended to upset some of the people who do clinical trials, who feel as though they're being contained in some way. But nonetheless, that was the recommendation of the Expert Advisory Committee, which was accepted by the NHMRC Council and the Minister, and so they are the new rules. So the things that won't change is that peer review remains the critical basis for the allocation of funding. There is continued commitment to at least 5% of the MREA annually being allocated to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research. There remains broad support for broad research in basic clinical public health and health services research. There also remains support for partnership with end users, for people in the commercial sector, and for people who do translation and implementation science. And there remains, of course, support for a diversity of researchers, including both males and females, and for full and part-time researchers and those who are undertaking career breaks. And in particular, that's where the ideas grants we think are going to be very valuable. It's also going to be possible for people who are applying for investigator grants to be applying as part-time researchers through that particular scheme, and also for a person to be part-time on a synergy grant. That won't disadvantage them if they do that. They'll simply apply for a fraction of their salary. So, for example, if a person is a staff specialist who chooses to allocate 50% of their time for research, then they would apply for 50% of their salary through the NHMRC, and the other 50% would be funded through the health department. So we hope that that will give people more flexibility to get part of their salary from one source and part from another. These changes will begin gradually with a plan for the first funding under this scheme to begin in January 2020. The introduction of interim capping arrangements will take place towards the end of this year, and in late 2018, early 2019, applications for funding through these new schemes will be opened, as I said, with a view to those grants being allocated in December 2019 and commenced in early 2020. So this is obviously not something that can be done overnight, because people have to gradually transition from the old grant scheme to the new grant scheme. There is a further presentation that Anne Kelso did as a webcast, which is available on the NHMRC website, that goes into a lot more detail than I've been able to this afternoon. I do know most of the details of what's in that presentation, so hopefully when we come to questions, presumably at the end of this, Steve, I'll be able to help answer some of those for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Very grateful. We are very grateful to you for that very clear exposition of the thinking behind the changes to NHMRC funding and the detail that is important to people considering applying for funding, not necessarily immediately, but in planning your future research career. Second presentation comes from Dr. Tony Penner, who again is no stranger to Western Sydney, and he has taken on the directorship of the Office of Health and Medical Research within the Ministry of Health in New South Wales, and I don't want to be patronising too much, Tony, but I think you've done a fantastic job in moving the contributions with the enthusiastic support of Minister Skinner from being simply a funding agency for infrastructure to one which is taking initiatives in fields as varied as new devices and translational research. So, Tony, it's a great pleasure to have you here this afternoon. He's struggled from his sick bed to be with us, so don't shake his hand afterwards and make sure that he doesn't cough on you or do anything. But, Tony, we look forward very much to what you have to say to us.
So, is that that one yours?
Great, and well, thank you, Steve, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. If you're going to only take one thing away today, it's the bottom left-hand corner. We have a Twitter account. Seriously. So we launched it on Tuesday for the medical devices launch on the Tuesday night, and my office was inundated on Wednesday like you would not believe. So the lesson, and it's been told to me many times, communicate, communicate, communicate. So there we are. That's the most important thing. And we'll tell you a lot more. So what I want to be able to do is just give you an outline of some of the things and background to a lot of the things that we're doing, and focus on medical devices and the translational grants, mainly because they're the big players at the moment. But we have other grant systems that are in play that we will enhance over the next year, which I'll say something about, but I can't say too much other than knowing that it's in the pipeline. And that's around the translational genomics and around other areas in that space. So this is, I took the slide out of a slide that our secretary gave to all the other agencies in the state. And one of the really important messages that I can say right at the moment, we're in a time where New South Wales Health, the Commonwealth Department of Health, is so receptive to research. It's something that you really need to take advantage of. At the moment, last week I was told that the Commonwealth Department has its fourth pillar in all the things it does, and that fourth pillar is research. And our secretary spoke last week to all the agencies across the state about the economic benefit of research, and she's totally sold on research, and I'll show you a few more slides. Clearly, what it shows here is that in Australia, and we're an ecosystem no different from the rest of Australia, is that we are very good at innovating and being creative. What we're not very good at is translating. And this is about commercialisation, but it's the same thing that in the whole area of implementing evidence, whether it's generated locally or adopted from state elsewhere. And it's something that I would, there's a video clip that Don has on our translational research grant scheme that I would encourage you to look at, because it really highlights the whole translation pathway, and he highlights the need for us to do better in that space. So why is New South Wales strong? And it is, and I'm not saying this just because you're here. We are a very diverse population. We have excellent education, excellent health system, we have excellent workforce, strong clinical networks. Our LHDs are organised in a way that no other health department, health jurisdiction is currently organised. These are things that we should really mobilise on. That's our LHDs, and we have another slide that I haven't got here that shows how the local health districts are brought together in the geographical hubs and their AHRTCs. So we have structure, which is important. So if there was something to, this government, this is the second term, the first term, if you had to identify, there was a lot of funding towards medical research support program, clinical trials, biobanking and so forth and so on. if you had to define the first term of government for, the first term for this government, it's around commercialisation. That was the big translational step that Minister Skinner put on the table, and we learnt a lot from that. And we've learnt, and I'm picking up a lot of phrases that's in Don's clip, but we learnt on the job. And I'll say a little bit more about that. We presented the fifth round on Tuesday, and so that defined a significant translational component to research. If we're going to define this term of government, it's about collaboration and translation in the clinical side of things, in health services research, clinical research, and so on. Absolutely critical. But let me put it to you that we're not ignoring the biomedical side of things and the basic sciences. That is in our radar for the next few years, so watch this space. But so these are all those that are in red are the ones that we've generated over the past in this current term. The Genomics Collaborative, $24 million went across there. It engaged a lot of players across the space. I won't say much more other than that there will be a continuation of support for the whole omics area, just not genomics, over the next 4 years. And what other things that are important? The early to mid-career and PhD scholarships, we'll certainly continue that in the next tranche. I'll say a little bit more about that. So this is, I want to highlight this, if you haven't seen it before, it is something that so I said the first term was really about driving commercialisation, translation. Our second term is really about driving translation into really the bottom end and also the top end, but more so on the bottom end. And this is driving towards value-driven care. Again, it's a slide that I borrowed from the Secretary. She really believes in this, so very supportive of translational research, and we're going to drive change through a lot of our programs to provide value-driven care. So, and this is something that clearly MRFF is also focusing on. Now I just want to, I'll go back. So I want to say something about the Medical Devices Fund. So I think we've given about over 30-odd million, closer to $40 million over the past few years on medical devices, and the whole translation from a prototype to almost to the marketing phase. And it was created really to drive us to probably have the next ResMed and Cochlear, to build a real ecosystem around med tech and to bring sort of more economic success to New South Wales, and also value for our patients. So one of the key things was that IP had to be in New South Wales, that it had to, if you were successful, the grant was undiluted, meant that we took no equity in it. If we were successful, the money then was repaid, and it increased the sort of amount of money that we can give into future years, and that the health system would adopt the technology or innovation at a reduced cost, a subsidised cost. There have been lots of learnings in this area. When we started, literally the only person who had any clinical input was me, and it was just bizarre. We sooner or later we quickly added a few other players, and we developed a whole clinical review, something that's quite unique in this whole space. And one of the challenges we had early on is that a lot of the players had no concept of how to connect with the health system. Zip. They would just get on an email distribution list and flick it to everybody, and I'm sure that ended up as spam. These were people that had highly innovative and creative ideas that went nowhere. And a lot of the players thought about their engagement with the sector in strange ways. And some of the opportunities that they had, there was almost like you had, and I'll say something about this later, you had solutions looking for problems, and we often say we want problems looking for solutions, but in fact there are opportunities in both spaces, and these players had really smart ideas but couldn't link in with the system. And if the clinicians weren't there to support them, and we're having this right up to the fifth round. The clinicians, and this is an important thing that I've really come to accept most recently. I'll tell you the story around a TRIGS program in the next set of slides. But if clinicians, now I'm saying clinicians, not clinician researchers, I'm saying if clinicians aren't involved very early on to frame the problem and look at the solution, the likelihood of success is very small. And so you really need to really look at those stakeholders and to really broaden the input into the thinking around what sort of support you give to an innovation. If you just focus on clinician scientists, who are obviously the brilliant players, and a lot of you would regard yourselves as clinician scientists, but you know as well as I do, an innovation can't occur just through yourselves. You need the broader church of clinicians in your group to support you. And if you don't do that well at the beginning, it's a nightmare to try to address it down the track. And I can give you many. I've had over the past 3 or 4 years, I've looked over 1,000 applications, a lot of them full applications, and a lot of them great ideas. And some of them cannot progress because they haven't had the support of a key group of players. And I'll mention that further. There was, for example, one group here, a great idea picked up by a biomedical person and a physicist to drive a portable infusion pump. Fantastic. It was more reliable, more accurate than the Baxter pumps. They tried it out in a particular place. It was developed in New South Wales. They've tried it in Western Australia because they couldn't link in with the system here. It ticked all the boxes. And when, at the end of the trial, it was really fantastic. At the end of the trial, they asked the charge nurse, the nurse unit manager, would you use this in your backyard? And the answer was no. Why? Because it was too disruptive. That meant that the cost of actually delivering the work moved from pharmacy to the nursing staff, and they weren't prepared to do it. So the actual design of it was a real big issue. So TRIGS. So the uniqueness of TRIGS, and we're going to put more money into TRIGS, the uniqueness of TRIGS is that it's an iterative model, really supporting people through the expression of interest phase right up to full application. So we have a helicopter view of what's happening in the state, and we try to help with applications. Again, I can't stress how important the whole clinician engagement is. Just to give you an idea. So most recently, a project was funded by TRIGS, enormous at our highest level, at about $1 million. And it had all the elements of what we wanted. Both the LHD wanted it, the ministry wanted it. It ticked all the boxes. You cannot believe it ticked all the boxes. What we stressed was that it had to be implementable and scalable. So people in the ministry met with them, I met with them, we went through it all, we all understood where we were, fantastic, about to deliver it. A month later, and this is only a month, about 2 months ago, a month later, I get an email and the chief investigator says, I've lost the will to live. You've asked me to try to go outside of my space to see if this could be implemented. So the two supporters were clinicians, scientists, brilliant, but when she went to the broader group of clinicians, there was no way, she said, I could really pull this off in 2 to 3 years. I would have had to have had all of their support before I'd go forward. So I had the LHT chief executive involved, I had the directors of research involved, and they agreed that the project was fantastic, but they needed a lot of work with their clinicians, really important. So some of the quick questions and tricks and from both. So we talk about you need to define the problem and then work out a research question and look for the solution. But I tell you, the solution for looking for a problem, don't ignore them, because serendipity always picks up things like this, and so you've got to be ready for a solution that will land for a problem that you weren't even aware of. So although I totally support, and that's what we drove, problem looking for a solution, don't forget the solution looking for a problem. And so for me, it links to one of the other things, I think the fifth point, how to navigate the system. If I can stress how important it is, the health system is complex. There are so many players who want to work with us, and they just don't know who to talk to. And when I look at our colleagues interstate and how they've driven change in Melbourne Health, you know, they strategise around linkage around people knowledge brokerage. You might think, well, that's a very soft science. Let me tell you, building relationships with big pharma and medtech, working out what they want, what we want, and so forth, so critical to moving ahead and getting funding. So really important. So you'll find that people who've got a solution knock on your doorstep. They've got to know who to talk to and how you link them. Clinician engagement, I mentioned how important that is. Look, so many collaborators are added to a TRIGS program that add no value. And one of the things that I've looked at and was challenged by was the very fact that a lot of players are on that list, and you have a very poor study design, and you see all the players there that are just superb. Why didn't the study get a better structure? So, and the last one is the enormous need for education, training, mentoring and guidance. So we're going to put more money into it. The MDCTP created a medical device commercialisation training program, an elite program, and also a health directed program helping people to understand medical technology and its commercialisation. And hopefully a lot of people from this LHD and other LHDs are going. It's highly regarded. And we're going to focus also on translational research, working with the Sachs Institute and the Ministry to do an online training course for translational research. And so that's a little bit more about that training program. I don't want to say much more. These are the things that we're going to continue. So there's going to be money. The programs I've mentioned will continue, and I'm looking to enhance a little bit more. And I'm also looking to see if I can help with that idea in the basic sciences, that the value of death towards the prototype, and seeing how I can enhance that. So they are things for the future. And again, the Twitter account is the most important thing. Okay, thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Tony. If people want to find out what grants and so on are available, can they just send you a Donald Trump tweet saying...
Absolutely.
So, and will things be put out on that account saying, wake up, it's time to put in a new TRIGS grant application, or... So that'll be quite a good point of contact for people wanting to know whether what you've got matches what they want. That's great. Excellent, thank you. The third presenter is Professor Don Nutbeam, who, for reasons known only to himself, was returned from the United Kingdom, where he fulfilled a 6-year stint as Dean, as Vice-Chancellor of Southampton University, and served with considerable distinction there, and has come back to Sydney and in his retirement is working harder than ever. And one of the roles in which he has helped us immensely in recent months was as serving as the interim executive officer of Sydney Health Partners, which introduced him to the intricacies of the Medical Research Future Fund. So I thought it would be very helpful for us to hear from Don about what the research funding opportunities are through the Future Fund, and also make reference to ways in which funding might be obtained through Sydney Health Partners. So Don, thank you for your company, and we look forward to hearing from you now.
Thanks very much. So the reason I returned to Australia is that I've learned throughout my career that the route to success is keep moving. It will never quite catch up with you, and you seem to be able to do all right with it. I was having a wry smile to myself because in contrast to the two previous speakers, so the NH and MRC distributes hundreds of millions of dollars in research funding each year, and New South Wales Ministry through TRIGS and the various other schemes that Tony spoke of is distributing tens of millions of dollars now. Much to my, genuinely, when I left, things were not so good. When I come back, the Ministry is very engaged in an extremely positive way. Sydney Health Partners, that I'll be primarily speaking about today, is currently distributing about $2 million a year, so please don't get excited. The other observation I make is that both of them hold great positions of responsibility. Bruce is chair of the NHMRC. Tony is the most senior executive in the New South Wales health system, responsible for medical and health and medical research. I'm not. And so that probably makes me highly irresponsible, and I shall enjoy that status during the course of my presentation. So quick introduction to Sydney Health Partners, because I won't assume that most of you will know too much about Sydney Health Partners. Only really been on the ground for about 18 months. I'm here today because the current Executive Director, Gary Jennings, is overseas, and I drew the short straw, but I'm really happy to speak on behalf of Sydney Health Partners. I was quite involved last year in trying to get the partnership established and functioning as an effective partnership. Steve, I think, mentioned it's one of the first 4. There are now, I think, 9 advanced health and research and translation centres, AHRTCs, recognised by the NHMRC. Very simple vision for Sydney Health Partners. It's working as a partnership to transform the way that research improves patient care and public health in our health system. And that's a really important point to keep in mind, that the focus is very much on working as a partnership, particularly with the LHDs and the Children's Hospital at Westmead, to deliver better patient outcomes and public health in the healthcare system. There are the partners, the 3 local health districts that Steve mentioned, and the Children's Hospital at Westmead, together with the University of Sydney, are at the core of the partnership, and all of our brilliant associated independent research institutes, which are on the screen and listed on the little banner there. Our objectives, again, I don't want to spend any time on this. You can look it up. We have a website. I don't know if we tweet or not, to be really honest with you. I'm sure somebody does. I think we do. I think we have a Twitter account, but it's not my thing particularly. But you can look it up. We have a pretty good web presence these days, and you can find out more about Sydney Health Partners. But I do think these 4 objectives capture really well what it is I think we're trying to do through the partnership. Again, primary focus on delivering patient and public benefit. We also want to ensure that our health system works, and in particular we're interested to understand and break down some of the barriers to collaborative and efficient working among researchers and clinicians to speed up the process of research translation. The 3 local health districts and the Children's Hospital represent about 1 in 10 of the population of Australia. So this is a real experiment trying to manage at scale. If we can make it work across Sydney Health Partners, it can work anywhere in Australia, to be completely honest. And lastly, I think for all of the partners, I think we see this as a way of distinguishing what we do and the way we work in such a way to make us internationally competitive. We want to be a place where leading researchers and clinicians aspire to work, and we believe that the partnership can help us achieve that. Again, I'm not going to get into the detail on this. The way the partnership is organised at the moment is we have a series of clinical research streams where we have individual translational research projects that are being supported in different ways in the areas that are listed there. And we also are interested at, if you like, the research infrastructure, the ecosystem that supports translational research, and some of the underlying structures that can enable us to be more effective. So we've got cross-cutting themes in informatics, biobanking, genomics, and so on, as there are listed there. Currently, within the ambit of Sydney Health Partners, we have about 40 collaborative projects, and by collaborative I mean that they're operating in at least 2 of our local health districts and among at least 3 or 4 of our partners. So they're genuine collaborations. Many of them were in place in one form or another before the partnership was established, and what we've been trying to do through the partnership is strengthen and accelerate the work that they've been doing. Now, as I've said, I'm absolutely in no position to be anything of a spokesperson on the MRFF, and I can't do that. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who would claim they could be a spokesperson on behalf of the MRFF, and because of my position of irresponsibility, I feel quite able to make a few quirky observations about the MRFF. Just in the same way that I referred you to the Sydney Health Partners website and OHMR's website, I would encourage you to have a look at what is published on the MRFF, and in particular the statement, the strategy and statement of priorities, because they are worth looking at. And I pulled out from that the simple opening statement that the MRFF aspires to create a health system that's informed by quality health and medical research. I pulled that out because it fits with some of the things I've been saying, that it puts the health system first. It says that the MRFF exists to create a health system that is fully informed by health and medical research. And I do think that orientation shows up somewhat in the first round of awards. I extracted this directly, and I've given the link there if you're really interested. I've extracted this directly from the budget statement, and again, the PR statement in the budget statement really does emphasise the strategy as I described it earlier, to deliver new medical breakthroughs, enhance patient care, improve health system outcomes, ensure Australia's health security, I'm assuming that means a sustainable healthcare system, and drive innovation. And there are the list, slightly quirky list, it has to be said, of things that have been funded through this first round. What I will observe in my quirky style, because I was quite engaged on behalf of Sydney Health Partners in discussions and negotiations that led eventually to the budget statement, and the processes that we had to go through as Sydney Health Partners and as the group of AHRTCs to get to the point where 10 million of this funding was devoted to the AHRTCs. A couple of observations I would make is that I think this list could best be described as partly strategic, genuinely reflecting the intentions as stated of the MRFF, partly political, in the sense that there are some things that the government has decided it wishes to see resources allocated to. And what you won't really know is that sitting behind this, there's been an extraordinary effort, I have to say largely brokered by a hugely under pressure department, to ensure that there is some transparency in the decision making, and certainly fairly good governance sitting behind it. And certainly my experience of engaging with this process was all about providing clear reassurance that any resource that was allocated through the AHRTCs would be open, competitive and transparently allocated, and that it would be subject to an organisation that had in place transparent, good quality governance. And I think that's reassuring to know that it's not just the Minister and his or her advisors sitting there and picking from a menu of things, that there's actually in a rather scrambled way, because there's no precedent for this in this first year, a genuine attempt, I think, to make sure that the foundations were put in place for good decision making going forward. Now, I make the point again that it was a mix of these things. It was a mix of strategy, politics, and genuine efforts at putting in place the foundations for transparency and good governance. The reason I think it's really important to focus on that is the scale, is the rate of increase of the MRFF over the next few years. As Bruce has indicated, it's quite possible that the funds to be allocated through the MRFF structure will rise to 250 million certainly in the next 3 or 4 years, and could get as high as $500 million within a relatively short period of time. And the scaling up year on year is quite phenomenal when you think about that. And I suspect certainly in these first 2 or 3 years it will continue to be this mix of strategy, policy and efforts to put in place a transparent structure that allows us to see how and why decisions have been taken. I'd have to say our goal in the AHRTCs is to create as large a funnel as possible. One of the advantages, I think, of being in at the early stages is if you get your funnel right and the amount of money grows, then you're pretty well placed. And honestly, I can say I have absolutely no idea how this scale up will be managed, but I do know from my own personal experience in government that in the end you can only land it in a number of ways in a number of places. And if you're in a good place, then you're more likely to get a fair share of the resource. But I honestly, I can't offer any more advice on the whole of the MRFF scheme than those individual, highly personal, quirky observations. And I'm sure others in the audience can offer greater insight and more information when we have our discussion session. I want to finish off very briefly, given the scaling effect here, the hundreds of millions from the NH and MRC, the tens of millions from the state government, down to the small amount of money that Sydney Health Partners is distributing through the MRFF. Just to talk to you a little bit about how that's going. Basically, in this very convoluted way, in order to ensure transparency and good governance, Sydney Health Partners has been invited to apply for MRFF funds through a particular grant stream, the so-called RART programme. And the programme has 2 parts. 2 million is available to each of the current, the original 4 AHRTCs, and another $2 million is available for nationwide schemes. That makes up the 10 million. We're trying to release that funding in 2 ways. Firstly, we were under enormous pressure to come up with a set of ideas that could be announced around the time or soon after the budget statement. We went through a very substantial process to be able to meet that requirement. And we were then, I think we will then be enabled to release more funds through a slightly less pressured process. Some of you will be aware of this process, some of you will have participated in this process, but the under pressure part was that we had to come up with 4 or 5 projects that we could fund that align with MRFF priorities that are listed there, could deliver improvements, observable improvements in a 12-month period, and we could be clear about how MRFF funding might add value, perhaps to an existing project. I'm going to take time over this. We went through I think, a reasonable process along the way. There was a review panel, which I was a member of. The other panel members are listed there. And we were able, in a space of weeks, working with some really great clinicians and researchers, to come up with a set of projects that we could put forward as a part of the initial MRFF bid. We were told we'd have a decision and we'd be able to announce funding in relation to this a bit sooner than seems to be the case, but nonetheless we're expecting to be in a position to make an announcement about that sometime in the next couple of weeks. And we've recommended support for these projects between 50 and 150,000 in this 1 year. Importantly, and this is probably the thing I really just want to leave you with, there will be a second round of funding. We'll have about somewhere around about $1 million or more to disperse, again just for a 1 year period in this first instance. And these will, again, these are the criteria very similar to the ones that I mentioned earlier on. The fit with MRFF priorities, the ability to provide demonstrable improvements within a relatively limited time, and a bit of clarity about how the MRFF funds will add value. We've now a reasonably, I think, open and transparent process. And a bit like Tony, we'll make sure through various social and other media that everybody is made fully aware of that process. But very likely the scheme will be launched at our annual workshop, which will be held on the 18th of November. So it's likely the scheme will be launched on the 18th, process of application and decisions early in the new year. It's okay, I thought it was reggae, basically. I was about to dance. There we go. Thank you. That's all I had to say. Thanks very much. Thank you.
So I'm very sorry that Don's pacemaker played up during that session. It's a bit ominous now that the noise has stopped altogether. Could we have the three speakers out the front? And this is your chance to ask the three presenters questions that would help clarify your understanding of the opportunities that are provided by the... Yes, Louise.
Hello, it's Louise Bauer, University of Sydney Kids Hospital, Westmead. I was wondering if you could reflect on the strategies to promote the growth of clinician researchers and where the barriers might be, not the early necessarily getting into PhDs, but actually people being able to stay as clinician researchers, whether they're nursing, allied health, medical, and so on, being able to grow as researchers there, because there are a lot of barriers to being able to continue as researchers in the clinical system.
So Louise, one of them is the very real possibility of people fractionating the salary that they apply for as an investigator. The risk that they face, of course, is that if they say to the local health district, well, I'm about to cut my fraction down to 50% so I can take up 50% NHMRC, PRF, for example.
Which of course will be less than the clinical side.
Well, A, there's that issue, and B is when they then don't get that in, say, 10 years' time, is the health system going to be prepared to give them back the other 50% that they had? So that remains a barrier that I think the health system has to address to try to encourage more people to become clinician investigators. The other thing that I think is encouraging is the Ideas Grant Scheme, which really does offer the opportunity for a person who has been a clinician perhaps for 10 years to decide that they want to actually spend some of their time and develop a career as a researcher to go into that without necessarily having a big track record, provided they've got some good ideas that may have been generated through the course of their clinical work. So I see that as a potential opportunity as well.
In addition to funding, are there any, maybe because we are talking about funding, maybe this is an AHRTC thing or maybe in New South Wales Health thing about the culture that allows research to flourish, because I think funding is one important thing, but various ones of us work either in groups or areas where we've been allowed to flourish, or you can see other areas where research is really, number 10 in the list of priorities.
I was going to comment on that because I must say I've been extraordinarily encouraged through the work I've done with Sydney Health Partners, the interactions I've had with the chief executives of the 3 local health districts and the Children's Hospital at Westmead, by their sincere commitment, I think, to try to create an environment and culture within which research can flourish. Now, there are lots of ways in which we can damage that, but nonetheless, what is encouraging, at least for us at this point, is I see no impediment at the top, and I see every interest and willingness as we identify barriers to try to overcome them. I think Bruce has highlighted some of the very practical grassroots issues. I think you're highlighting what I would observe is that some of the other barriers are more cultural and environmental. I actually do think this is an issue that Sydney Health Partners, where the existence of Sydney Health Partners can actually add some value. We can actually promote that discussion. We can support, highlight outstanding clinician researchers, and we can give some further thought to how do you advance your career down that route as opposed to more professional routes that exist.
Tony.
That's absolutely true, and I think one of the advantages of Elizabeth Koch, our new Director General, having come from the Children's Hospital, is she realises very concretely the value of research as a driver of high quality care. And I agree with Don. I think that's one of the major reasons Sydney Health Partners got across the line. It was very much Warwick Anderson's idea as the CEO of the NHMRC at the time, was this had to be health system led. The university had to consciously take a back seat in this application process, and I think that was why we were successful.
Tony?
So Bruce and Don, just a comment first and then a question to Tony. In addition to what you said, Bruce, I think there's also the sector allocation and projected allocations for clinician scientists and practitioner fellowships, which hopefully, as I understand from alcohol and CalSO, will be directed back through NHMRC in terms of the same sort of assessment process. So I think that's additional. I want to ask Tony about this first valley of death, which I guess you alluded to, and that is whether, and maybe you could talk a little bit about interactions between state and MRFF, because that's obviously a priority for MRFF. In the second round of funding, they've actually talked about committing some money to commercialisation, which they didn't do at first.
So I haven't had any formal interactions with the MRF in regards to where they go and up and what you see on the websites, and I think you know as much as I do in that space. And that is challenging, although I do have some inroads into the people that are the architects of putting it together, which is always useful. And so there is a significant component that's politically driven. And I think the number that's quoted is that 30% is discretion of the minister. So that's a significant amount of money. Yeah, it is. I think that's important. What was the other question, Tony?
Well, I think that's it. I think this is something we talk about healthcare outcomes all the time, but commercialisation, the innovation strategy is going to be for 2030 released soon, and that's through BTF. That's the other translation of the fund. So there's some big opportunities there through first and second valleys of debt. And I would imagine that getting the state and Commonwealth together would be, because that's what they want.
So we have had the opportunity, and we will be meeting with Senator Biggs to talk about aspects of med tech and that first value of debt. I think, as well as I've been speaking to all the executive directors of the MRIs, and if I did a helicopter view at South Wales. It's in the biomedical area. We do a lot of basic science that then has to be translated into something. A lot of it is, a molecule of some sort. We don't have the capacity at the moment in a major way with big pharmacy to drive the high throughput drug screening, the libraries, the formulation of drugs and so forth, which will then allow you to have a prototype to go to early phase clinical trials. And, Victoria does, and in fact they've even poured more money into Monash, you've just recently seen, because they see that as a major sort of pathway in the translation for the biomedical. I think we have the resources within our universities, but it requires to unlock them and bring them together. And I know, having had discussions with a number of players, they're putting in grants for major sort of developers in this space that some of the universities are considering putting their resources together. But as I see it, it's bigger than one university. So I think to really manage that early phase for the biomedical, for New South Wales, it requires a significant underinvestment and a significant refund. Can I come back to something that you raised? I think the issue of trying to bring about change in the health system is really driven by the key performance indicators of the Chief Executive. And there's no doubt that we have a leadership in Australia. At the Arts Conference was made, we were lauded as a state that we are the first state. In fact, very few players around the world have KPIs for the Chief Executive. And clearly we're focusing on clinical trials. But that's a given. That'd be fantastic, and then we broaden it. The question that I think was asked of me, how much further should you go to really embed it in the system? Because we know that within an LHD, some hospitals are good, some hospitals aren't, some departments aren't. And the issue is to drive though, if you really truly believe that the health system needs research, then the KPI has to be down to hospital level and the department head level. And I don't think that's a road too far. I really don't. And then if you have that engagement at whatever level, it might be saying number of patients that are recruited to clinical trials. If you're zero and the next door is 400, you say, well, what is it that you're doing, they're not doing? So unless we drive that, it's not going to change. Data drive change in the story. I can talk about all the soft sciences, about values and things like that. That will take time. Data will, KPIs will drive. And I think we're there.
Question over here.
Hi, it's Julie Radford here. I have a question for us about the investigator grants. So, assuming they sort of encompass your PhD scholarships, to your ECRs, to your practitioner fellowships and all of those, are they all going to be sort of viewed in one big bucket, or will they be kind of compared against other, the same grouping? So, will all those fit together in there? And what's the cap as well in terms of the project? Because I think having the project funding is fantastic, and we have that with the Heart Foundation, but only being able to small little bits of little pilot projects is also problematic.
Firstly, to answer the cap question, as far as I understand, there's no designated cap, and an understanding of the total package for the research component of the grant will probably be on the order of 250,000. My understanding is that the PhD program the scholarship program will remain separate, so it won't be funded out of the investigator grant scheme. But just check on the detail of that.
So the sort of ECRs through the CDF people,
That
how will they
is
sort
all-
of get compared? Just a relative to opportunity comparison
Correct. Yes.
in one month?
Yep.
Last question. Who would like? Yes.
So just extending from that question, when the PSP packages, so therein is a big problem if you can only ask for a small number of grants and you're an investigator grant. So for example, I've just been awarded an SRF, but that won't meet my salary at level D and level E.
Yes.
And I'm not in an MRI, so how will these investigators bridge that salary gap if the PSPs don't sort of change?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think this might remain an age-old problem, and some universities will bridge it, some won't. If you've got a university affiliation, some hospitals,
University of
Yes.
Sydney.
Sorry?
But will that be the same for the PSP packages, so even for the other sorts of classes of grants, the PSP packages will still be a support package and they won't be they won't be like the ARC, you actually ask for a person and get the amount of money you need to employ that person.
It'll be a package of support. The levels of those support packages 5, I think, are published on the website. You've no doubt seen those. I think the issue of the salary gap, though, is still not solved.
It's a massive one.
I know it is. I used to run a faculty, I know it's a massive problem.
It's a very blue sky vision and this massive hole in the middle.
Yeah, look, I agree. I suppose perhaps something to fill in the blue sky vision might be the MRFF. You saw there is some support for fellowships through MRFF. I still think that one of the things that's not clearly worked out is how the MRFF and the NHMRC are going to interact. That's still a big question. Anne is on the steering group. The CEO of the NHMRC is on the MRFF steering group. But as Don alluded to, I was around when, as head of the GO8 Medical School Deans, at the time the MRFF rules, if you like, were being developed. And there was a lot of argy-bargy backwards and forwards with the Department and the Minister's Office about how money was going to be allocated. And at the end of the day, the government stood its ground and said, we really reserve the right to be responsible for allocation of a significant proportion of this as we see fit. And as Don said, it's about 30% at the moment. So I suppose that's both good and bad. It means that they have control of it, but it also means they're open to being lobbied. Now you've seen they've been very heavily lobbied by the ALS people. I know there are other people, the people who look after or advocate for people with anorexia, bulimia, are beating a big path to the door of government, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to see a significant tranche of money being allocated to that area of research. So the moral of the story is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You need to be in there advocating for your area if that's what you want. And get your funnel out, that's right.
Well, I think that's a good challenge on which to conclude. And I want first to thank our three speakers for setting aside the time and coming here and sharing their insights and enthusiasm and understanding of these granting systems. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Mark Smith and Cecilia Chung for their work in organising this, and to Helen Abiani for keeping them up to the mark. So to all of those people who've made this evening possible, our thanks, and safe journeying home. Thank you for coming.